There's something about small towns that always feels timeless. Maybe it's the way everyone knows each other, or how the streets look like they've been frozen in time. Either way, Ravens Hollow had that timeless charm, the kind of place where you grow up, move away, and then find yourself drifting back to when life doesn't go as planned. That's exactly what happened to me. After years of living in the city, chasing a career in marketing that never quite took off, I found myself back in my childhood home, in a town I'd long left behind. I'd inherited the place after my parents passed, and though I wasn't thrilled about coming back, it was better than staying stuck in the endless grind of a dead-end job. The house was old, nestled at the edge of town, just where the fields stretched out toward the woods. It was quiet, almost too quiet after years of city noise. I hadn't lived in a place this quiet in years, but there was something else about Ravens Hollow, something I couldn't quite shake. It had always been a strange town. There were stories, of course. Every town has its urban legends, but in Ravens Hollow, they felt different, more real somehow. And then there was the legend of the phantom trick-or-treaters. It was early October, and the whole town was already preparing for Halloween. Decorations went up on every street, fake cobwebs, grinning jack-o'-lanterns, skeletons hanging from porches. There was an excitement in the air, the kind that always comes with fall. But beneath it, there was something else, something darker that I could feel but not quite name. One evening, I found myself talking to Mrs. Whitlock, my elderly neighbor who lived across the street. She was one of those people who seemed like they'd been around forever, always on her front porch with a cup of tea, watching the world go by. I was returning from the grocery store when she waved me over, her wrinkled face lighting up with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Getting ready for Halloween, George?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of smoking. "Yeah, just grabbing some candy. You know how it is. Kids'll come knocking soon." Her smile faltered for a second and she glanced over her shoulder before leaning in a little closer. "You best keep some candy by the door, dear, just in case." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if I'd heard her right. "Just in case?" She nodded slowly, her eyes darting around as if someone might be listening. "You wouldn't want to upset them." "Upset who?" I asked, feeling a strange chill crawl up my spine. Mrs. Whitlock's face darkened, and she looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "The children? They'll come knocking soon. You'd do well to answer." I didn't know what to say to that. She was clearly talking about the local legend, the phantom trick-or-treaters. I'd heard about them growing up, though I'd never given it much thought. It was just another spooky story, like the ones you tell around a campfire to scare your friends. "Mrs. Whitlock," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "You're not seriously telling me you believe in that old story, are you?" She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked me dead in the eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not a story, George. It's a warning." The next day, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Whitlock's words more than I wanted to. It was just a legend, I reminded myself. A silly story about ghost children who supposedly wandered the town on Halloween night, knocking on doors and demanding candy. But still, the way she'd said it, the fear in her voice, it stuck with me. Later that afternoon, I ran into Jake, the town's postman, as I was checking my mail. He was an older guy, probably in his 50s, with a grizzled beard and a cigarette permanently hanging from his lips. "Hey, George," he called as he approached, his mailbag slung over his shoulder. "Settling back into town?" "Yeah, trying to, anyway," I replied, sorting through the junk mail. "It's been a while." Jake nodded, taking a drag from his cigarette. "You hear about the phantom trick-or-treaters?" I looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Yeah, Mrs. Whitlock mentioned something about it. Just a local legend, right?" He gave me a look that sent a shiver down my spine, his cigarette dangling loosely from his lips. "Most folks think it's just a story. But you should be careful, George. People go missing around here on Halloween. Kids, mostly." I frowned. "Missing? What do you mean?" Jake glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. Last 5 years, 4 kids disappeared on Halloween night. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. People don't talk about it much, but, well, let's just say the phantom trick-or-treaters aren't just some old wives' tale. He didn't wait for me to respond. He just tipped his hat and walked away, leaving me standing there with a knot forming in my stomach. That night, I had the first dream. It was subtle at first, just me standing at my front window, watching as children in costumes ran up and down the street, their laughter echoing through the cool autumn air. But something was off. The sky was too dark, the trees too still. And then, I heard the knocking. I opened the door, expecting to see a group of kids holding out their bags for candy, but there was no one there. Just the wind rustling the leaves on the ground. I looked down and saw something strange. The candy I'd left on the porch was gone, and in its place were small footprints, leading away from the house. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreams didn't stop after that. That night, they got worse. In one dream, I was walking through the empty streets of Ravens Hollow, and everywhere I looked, there were jack-o'-lanterns with grotesque, twisted faces. They watched me as I passed, whispering my name in low, raspy voices. In another, I saw the children again, standing in the distance, their faces hidden behind masks. One of them stepped forward, pointing at me. And, in a voice that chilled me to the bone, he said, "We're coming for you, George." When I woke up that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As Halloween drew closer, the air in Ravens Hollow seemed to shift. The festive decorations were still up, the jack-o'-lanterns still smiling their eerie grins from porches, but the town felt off. The usual sense of excitement around Halloween was absent. People hurried through the streets, avoiding eye contact, and there was a constant low hum of tension. It didn't help that my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitlock, grew more cryptic by the day. Every time I saw her, she seemed more nervous, her hands shaking as she clutched her tea on the porch. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Ravens Hollow grew even stranger. The streets felt emptier, quieter. Even during the day, there was a heaviness in the air. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 older women whispering near the canned goods aisle. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. "Did you see the newcomer? He doesn't know what's coming," one of them said, casting a glance in my direction. The other woman nodded solemnly. "They never do. Poor man. I just hope he listens." When I walked past them, their conversation stopped abruptly, and they hurried away, avoiding my eyes. That night, I was cooking dinner when the TV in the living room caught my attention. The local news anchor's voice filled the room, sounding graver than usual. Authorities are still investigating the disappearance of a young boy who was last seen trick-or-treating in Ravens Hollow on Halloween night last year. This marks the 4th disappearance in 5 years, all of them occurring around Halloween. Police have yet to find any leads or connections between the cases, but the town remains on high alert as Halloween approaches once again. My stomach turned as I listened. 4 disappearances, no bodies, no trace of the missing kids. Now the warnings felt different, too serious to ignore. Desperate for answers, I decided to do some digging into the town's history, but I needed something that could explain what was happening. The town library was as old as the rest of Ravens Hollow, its shelves lined with dusty books that hadn't been touched in years. I spent hours combing through records, old newspaper clippings, and town archives, hoping to find something about the disappearances, about the legend of the phantom trick-or-treaters. As I sifted through the yellowed pages of old newspapers, I found articles dating back to the 1950s, stories of missing children, strange occurrences on Halloween night. One article described faint figures seen wandering the streets at midnight, children's voices calling out from empty alleyways. Another detailed an unsolved case of a group of trick-or-treaters who disappeared after knocking on a door that never opened. And then I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Kessler, the elderly librarian, standing there, her face lined with worry. She must have been in her 70s, but she moved quietly, almost too quietly for her age. "Looking into our town's history, dear?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. I nodded, not sure how to respond. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "That's a dangerous thing to do around Halloween. You don't want to dig too deep." Before I could ask what she meant, she slipped a piece of paper into my hand. I unfolded it, and in shaky handwriting, I saw a single sentence. "The children come for those who don't believe. Be ready." When I looked up, Mrs. Kessler was gone. Halloween night arrived like an unwelcome guest. The day had passed uneventfully, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough that even the crisp autumn breeze couldn't cut through it. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the glow of porch lights and jack-o'-lanterns, I found myself pacing around my house, unsure of what to expect. The strange warnings from Mrs. Whitlock and the postman, Jake, still echoed in my head, mingling with the disturbing dreams that had plagued me for days. The piece of paper Mrs. Kessler had given me at the library felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, its ominous message replaying over and over in my mind. "The children come for those who don't believe. Be ready." I wasn't sure if I believed any of it, but I wasn't willing to take any chances either. I had a bowl of candy sitting by the door, just as Mrs. Whitlock had advised, though I hadn't seen many trick-or-treaters out that night. The streets were unusually quiet, the usual Halloween excitement absent, as though the town itself was hiding in anticipation. I tried to focus on other things, cooking dinner, flipping through the channels on the TV, but nothing could shake the growing unease gnawing at me. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a warning. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m., the town was eerily silent. No laughter from trick-or-treaters, no movement on the streets, just the faint rustling of dead leaves outside and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I caught myself glancing at the clock every few minutes, each passing second making my anxiety grow. I decided to step outside for some air. Maybe I was just overthinking things. The chilly October air stung my face as I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The street was dark, save for the occasional flicker of a jack-o'-lantern or the dim glow of a porch light. My breath came out in soft clouds, dissipating into the cold night. Then, I heard it. A faint knock, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, straining to listen. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the stillness of the night. My heart started to race as I slowly turned toward the source of the sound. There, standing at the edge of my driveway, were 3 small figures. At first, they looked like any other trick-or-treaters. They were wearing costumes, old-fashioned ones, the kind you'd see in black and white Halloween photos. A ghost, a little witch, and something that resembled a skeleton, but there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Their faces were shadowed beneath their costumes, and they didn't move. They just stood there, staring up at me. The ghost lifted a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate movement that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was crawling up my spine. "Hey there," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "You kids out trick-or-treating this late?" They didn't respond. They just stood there, staring. A shiver ran through me. "Hang on," I muttered, turning back toward the door. I grabbed the bowl of candy I'd left by the entryway and walked back out onto the porch. I had no idea why these kids were still out at this hour, but I wasn't about to ignore them. Not after everything I'd heard. I stepped down onto the driveway and held out the bowl. "Here you go. Take whatever you like." For a moment they didn't move. The 3 of them just stood there, staring at me with those shadowed faces, their figures barely visible under the dim streetlight. Then, the little witch stepped forward, her hand reaching out slowly, almost reluctantly, as if she wasn't sure what to do. Her hand hovered over the candy for a moment before she grabbed a single piece, a small chocolate bar, and pulled back. The others followed her lead, each taking just one piece of candy before stepping back. "Happy Halloween," I said, forcing a smile. Again, no response. They turned in unison, their movements slow and unnatural, and began walking back down the street, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, staring after them, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something deeply unsettling about the encounter, but I couldn't explain why. They were just kids. But why had they felt so wrong? I shook off the feeling and turned to go back inside, but as I reached for the door, I heard a voice. A small, whispering voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "We'll come back for you." I whipped around, my heart racing, but the street was empty. The 3 trick-or-treaters were gone. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The words echoed in my head, chilling me to the bone. Had I imagined it? I must have. It was late, I was tired, and the stories I'd heard were playing tricks on my mind. I went back inside, trying to calm myself. But as I sat down on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The strange occurrences started almost immediately after the children left. At first, it was small things, barely noticeable. The lights flickered once or twice, the air in the house grew colder, and the faint sound of laughter seemed to drift in through the windows. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe kids still out on the streets. The radio, which had been off, suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by what sounded like faint whispers. I walked over to turn it off, but just as I reached for the dial, I heard my name, soft, barely audible but unmistakable. "George." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the radio off, but the whispers continued, faint and persistent, as if they were coming from inside the walls. I backed away, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic to any of it. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call someone, anyone. But the screen flickered and went dark. The house felt suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed from somewhere outside. I moved through the house, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I passed by the hallway mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw something or someone standing behind me. A small figure, dressed in a tattered costume, its face obscured by shadow. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The mirror, however, still showed the faint outline of a child just for a moment, before the reflection returned to normal. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the mirror, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. After pacing around the house and trying to calm myself down, I decided to take a shower, hoping the warm water would soothe my frayed nerves. But as I stepped out of the bathroom, wiping the steam from the mirror, I froze. There, written in the condensation, were the words, "You should have given us more." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. No one had been in the house but me. I wiped the mirror clean, but the message remained, the letters stark and clear against the glass. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I hurried out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The strange occurrences grew more intense, more unsettling. At one point I heard the front door creak open, even though I'd locked it. I rushed to the entrance, but when I checked, the door was closed, the deadbolt still in place. I could have sworn I heard the door open, and footsteps, small, soft, as if children were running inside my house. I also checked the porch, but it was empty, only the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. It was around 10 p.m. when lights flickered on and off. The TV turned itself on, playing static. The furniture shifted slightly, as if someone or something had pushed it out of place. Every so often, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps running through the house, but whenever I checked, there was no one there. I even received a text from an unknown number, the message chilling me to the bone. "We're coming to play." I couldn't take it anymore. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, its steady rhythm the only sound in the house. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands gripping my knees, staring at the front door as if it might open by itself at any moment. The house had grown unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there. The candy bowl sat empty now, the wrappers discarded on the coffee table outside, like forgotten evidence of something I didn't fully understand. I hadn't had any more visitors since the strange trio of trick-or-treaters. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see, but I could feel. I'd never been superstitious, never believed in ghosts or hauntings, but right now, sitting in my own home, I wasn't so sure anymore. At around 10:15 p.m., I heard footsteps again. They were light, almost playful, like children running down the hall. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened earlier. But when I heard them again, closer this time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I stood up, my heart pounding, and slowly made my way toward the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved, the house feeling far too large, far too empty for comfort. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and quiet, the shadows long and menacing in the dim light. As I stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped. I glanced around, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. There was nothing there. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, the windows dark. And yet, I could feel something, a presence, just out of sight. I turned, ready to head back to the living room, when I saw it. A small figure standing at the end of the hallway. My heart stopped. It was one of the children, the little witch from earlier. Her old-fashioned costume looked even more tattered now, her face hidden beneath the shadow of her hat. She was standing perfectly still, her small skeletal hand raised as if she was about to knock on a door. I blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty again. I retreated to the living room, my hands shaking, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really seen anything. But the moment I sat down, I noticed something different. The mirror above the fireplace, the same one that had shown me the reflection earlier, was fogging up as though someone had breathed on it. I stood up, moving slowly toward it, my breath catching in my throat. There, written in the foggy condensation, was another message. "We warned you." I stumbled back, the blood draining from my face. The writing seemed to shimmer in the dim light, the letters twisting slightly. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The house groaned around me, the temperature dropping even further. I could see my breath now, small clouds of mist forming in front of me as I stood there, frozen in place. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself it was just some elaborate Halloween prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And it wasn't done with me yet. A sudden crash came from the kitchen, the sound of glass shattering. I jumped, my pulse spiking as I rushed toward the source of the noise. When I reached the kitchen, I saw that one of the cabinet doors had swung open, and a glass had fallen onto the floor, shattering into pieces. I carefully stepped over the broken glass, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing out of place, except for the fact that the window above the sink was wide open. I could have sworn I'd locked it earlier, but now it hung open, letting the cold night air flood into the room. I shut the window, my hands trembling, and backed out of the kitchen. I couldn't stay in here any longer. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of the house. Just as I reached for my coat, a soft knock echoed through the house. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of children's voices, muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. They were outside, the trick-or-treaters. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard them. But I knew that wasn't an option, not after everything that had happened. Slowly, I opened the door, the hinges creaking in the stillness of the night. They were there again. The same 3 children. Their costumes were even more tattered now, dirt-stained and torn at the edges. Their faces were still hidden, shadows clinging to them like a second skin. They stood there staring up at me. One of them, the little ghost, stepped forward, holding out a small bony hand. "Trick or treat," he said, his voice hollow. I swallowed hard, my hand shaking as I grabbed a few pieces of candy from the bowl beside the door. I held them out, but the boy didn't move. He just stood there, his hand outstretched, waiting. "Take it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The little ghost tilted his head, his hand still hovering in the air. "It's not enough," he said, his voice suddenly deeper, darker. My stomach twisted. The little witch stepped forward this time, her voice soft, but filled with malice. "You should have given us more." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. They just stood there, staring at me, their dark eyes unblinking, their small bodies perfectly still. The house groaned again, the wind outside picking up, and the front door slammed shut with a force that made me jump. I spun around, heart pounding, but the house was empty. When I turned back to open the door, they were gone. The porch was empty. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The clock on the wall chimed, the sound reverberating through the house, marking the stroke of 11 p.m. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was closing in on me. I knew they were coming back. I could feel it. I could hear their footsteps in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The house was alive with noise, the creaking of the floors, the rattling of the windows, the low hum of whispers filling the air. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my coat, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and rushed for the front door. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was real and what wasn't. My phone was still dead. The landline had been cut off earlier. The cold night air hit me as I bolted out of the house and into the darkened street. The world outside seemed eerie. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the empty road. I could hear the faint rustling of trees in the wind. I ran to my closest neighbor's house, Mrs. Whitlock's. Her porch light was on, a faint glow against the oppressive darkness. My knuckles rapped hard against her front door, panic surging through my body. "Mrs. Whitlock, please open up, I need help." I knocked again, harder this time, my heart pounding. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for me to glimpse Mrs. Whitlock standing in the shadows, her frail figure barely visible. "George?" Her voice was weak, trembling. "What are you doing out at this hour?" I need to call the police. Something's happening. The kids, they're back. They came to my door and now they're in my house." My words tumbled out frantic and desperate. But Mrs. Whitlock just stared at me, her eyes dark and distant. "Go home, George. Get some rest. Don't make them angry." The door slammed shut before I could say another word. I stumbled back, overwhelmed by the cold dread settling in my chest. I had no choice. I had to find help. My next thought was the police station. Surely they couldn't ignore this. They had to listen. I ran down the street, the soles of my shoes slapping against the pavement as I rushed toward the center of town. My thoughts were racing. What would I even say? When I reached the station, the lights were still on, a single officer standing behind the counter. I burst in, gasping for air, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You have to help me," I shouted. "There's something happening at my house. Children, these ghost kids, they're trying to..." The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Ghost kids, sir, it's Halloween. We've already had a few prank calls tonight. I suggest you calm down." "It's not a prank. Please, you have to come with me. Check it out." But the officer shook his head. "Look, maybe you're just spooked by all the Halloween stuff. Happens all the time. People think they're seeing things. It's just stress." I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. They weren't going to help. No one was. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible now. "I'm not crazy." The officer gave me a tight smile. "Go home. Get some sleep." I turned and stumbled back out into the street. I was on my own. Desperate for answers, I made one last decision. I had to speak to someone who could tell me more about the legend. Someone who would believe me. The town historian, Mr. Harlan, lived on the outskirts of Ravens Hollow. He'd been there for decades, knew the town's every secret. If anyone could explain what was happening to me, it was him. By the time I reached Mr. Harlan's house, it was almost 11:30 p.m. The old man opened the door cautiously, peering out from behind a pair of thick glasses. "George, what on earth are you doing here at this hour?" "I need to talk to you about the phantom trick-or-treaters," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "They came to my house tonight." Mr. Harlan's face darkened immediately. "You shouldn't be speaking about them, George. Not now. Not so close to midnight." I pushed past him, desperate. "You know the legend. Tell me, what are they? What's happening to me?" The old man sighed, shutting the door behind him. "It's not a legend, not really. Back in the 1940s, a group of children went missing on Halloween night. They were trick-or-treating, just like any other kids, but the people of this town, they refused them, slammed doors in their faces, chased them away." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "And they died? They were last seen wandering the streets, knocking on doors. Some say they got lost in the woods. Others say the spirits of the town's past claimed them for their own." I shuddered, the pieces starting to fall into place. "And now they come back?" Mr. Harlan nodded. "It's been happening for years. You're not the first." The gravity of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So, what do I do?" Mr. Harlan sighed. "You can't. Once they've chosen you, it's too late. No, there has to be something." "There's only one way to keep them at bay," Mr. Harlan muttered, glancing at the clock on his wall. "You must find their graves. Leave them an offering, something that shows respect. Something from your own childhood, maybe. Do it before midnight." "Where are the graves?" "The old cemetery. They're unmarked. But you'll know when you're close." It was almost 11:45 p.m. I had to hurry. As I rushed back toward the cemetery, the town around me seemed to warp and shift. The streets were empty, but I could feel the children watching me from the shadows, their eyes following my every move. I reached the cemetery, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and hurried through the rows of old tombstones. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around me, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, small, shuffling footsteps. I ran, scanning the ground for any sign of the graves, when I felt something brush against my ankle. I stumbled, looking down to see a small, pale hand reaching out from under the earth. Another hand followed, and then another, until a group of skeletal hands were reaching for me from beneath the soil. I screamed, backing away, my heart racing. I had to find the graves. I had to finish this before it was too late. The clock struck 11:50 p.m. as I finally spotted them. 3 unmarked graves, hidden beneath a layer of vines and dirt. The phantom children stood nearby, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I fumbled through my pockets, pulling out the candy I had left and a small toy, a metal truck I'd found in the attic earlier that week that I've kept in my jacket's pocket. It was all I had. I placed the offerings on the graves, my hands shaking, and stepped back, praying it would be enough. The children stared at the offerings for a long moment, their dark eyes unreadable, and then, slowly, they began to disappear, fading into the night like shadows. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. They were gone. But as I walked back toward my house, something nagged at the back of my mind. The wind still carried the faint sound of children's laughter. The next morning, I found a small piece of candy on my doorstep. They were still watching. In the weeks following that harrowing Halloween, Ravens Hollow seemed to settle back into its usual quiet rhythm. The festive decorations came down, replaced by the simple trappings of an approaching winter. Yet, for me, the chill in the air never seemed to lift. I made it a point to visit the cemetery once a week, leaving small trinkets and treats at the unmarked graves. It felt strange, morbid even, but some part of me believed it was necessary, as if this was the only way to keep them at bay. But the sense of being watched never quite faded. The uneasy feeling lingered like a shadow that stretched far beyond Halloween night. And then, one foggy morning in early November, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Jake, the postman, approaching with his mailbag slung over his shoulder. His usual gruff demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite place. Sympathy, fear. "George," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Heard about your visit to the cemetery." I didn't reply, just stared at him, waiting for him to continue. He took a slow drag from his cigarette before letting out a deep sigh. "You did what you had to, I suppose. But you should know, no one ever really leaves Raven's Hollow. At least, not once they've been marked." A cold shiver ran through me. "What do you mean, marked?" Jake flicked his cigarette away, his gaze shifting to the ground. "Those children, they weren't just looking for candy, they wanted acknowledgement, and by giving it to them, you tied yourself to this place. You'll always feel them watching. You'll always be a part of their game now." I took a step back, shaking my head. "No, there has to be a way to break free." Jake's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw genuine sorrow there. "I wish there was, George, but once you've opened the door, it doesn't close so easily." I watched as he walked away, disappearing into the morning mist. The days turned into months, and the memories of that Halloween night faded, though never entirely. The faint laughter still drifted through the air on some nights, and every so often, I'd find a small piece of candy left on my doorstep. The offerings at the graves kept the whispers at bay, but the feeling that I was never truly alone persisted.